Good afternoon and welcome back to Never Is Now, ADL's signature summit on anti-Semitism and hate. I'm Shira Goodman, ADL's Director of Campaigns and Outreach, and I'm so pleased to be the moderator for this panel, How Marginalized Communities Can Advocate Together. ADL has always believed that we cannot fight anti-Semitism without fighting all forms of hate, and that we cannot wage this fight against hate alone. During this hour, as we talk with the leaders of several organizations and ADL partners representing diverse and often marginalized communities, we'll focus on the power of advocacy and partnership, two big tools in the arsenal of mission-driven organizations and in the fight against hate. I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers: Ambassador Marcela Solorio, Consul General of Mexico in Los Angeles; Edith Klein, President and CEO of Keshet; Jerica Richardson, Senior Vice President of Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives at the National Urban League; and Sonal Shah, President of the Asian American Foundation. Because we only have an hour and we want to get right into our conversation, I'll direct you to their very impressive bios on the speakers page at the neverisnow.org site. Please don't forget you can ask questions by clicking on the Q&A button to the right of the video. If you type your questions during the panel, we'll select several to ask our panelists after our initial conversation. We'll start off with a fundamental question. Why are advocacy and partnership so important, and how can the two be leveraged together to serve your critical mission? Let's start with you, Jerica.
Well, thank you, Shira, and many thanks to ADL for sponsoring this important conversation. I'm Jerica Richardson, Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives at the National Urban League, and it's an honor to be on a panel with this amazing group of women leaders. The National Urban League is one of the oldest and largest legacy civil rights organizations in America, and we were founded in 1910 in an effort to support hundreds of thousands of Black migrants who were fleeing oppression, persecution, poverty, and domestic terrorism at the hands of the KKK in the American South. And they were seeking opportunity in the North, Midwest, and West. Unfortunately, they didn't find the promised land that they were seeking. They were met with inadequate housing and education options, poor working conditions, and segregation and racism almost as hostile as what they experienced in the South. The National Urban League works to lift barriers to opportunity for African Americans and other underserved communities. And we advocate not only for equity in all aspects of life, but for justice. Justice is one of the core pillars of the League, and it is exactly why my division, the Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiative Division, was created in the aftermath of the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many others, and during the social justice awakening that we saw in response to the 2020 pandemic. This critical moment deepened partnerships between so many diverse and marginalized communities and organizations, and it really gave birth to the rich and renewed advocacy movement we are now seeing, which is so critically important. And I'm really looking forward to today's conversation, and just thank you again, Shira and ADL, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jerica. Edith, what does advocacy and partnership mean to Keshet?
Thanks so much, Shira, and I want to echo Jerica's words. It's really an honor to be on this panel with each of you, Jerica, Sonal, and Marcela. And thank you to ADL for convening this important conversation and for being a longtime partner to Keshet and to so many other justice organizations. So for Keshet, Keshet is an organization that works to advance LGBTQ equality in Jewish life. We were established initially really with a focus on internal Jewish life. Working to make synagogues and Jewish community centers and Jewish youth movements and Jewish federations and all Jewish institutions places where LGBTQ people can feel a sense of belonging and feel seen and celebrated. Over the years, we have moved on to also work to mobilize Jewish community members to fight for LGBTQ rights in the broader world, both because all of us are needed in order to do that work, and because we believe that a Jewish community really can only be a place that holds up values of LGBTQ inclusion and belonging and equality if that community is standing up for LGBTQ rights in the broader world. So we've worked for marriage equality, for trans rights, Now we're working, as ADL is as well, for the passage at long last. We're not there yet, but we will get there. The passage at long last of the Equality Act, which will establish federal protections for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people to protect us against discrimination in various settings. And this work is so critical to do in partnership. It's the only way that the work can happen. So we work in partnership with not only LGBTQ rights organizations, of course, outside of the Jewish world, but numerous social justice organizations outside of the Jewish world. And then we likewise see ourselves as a social justice organization that stands in solidarity with other justice organizations. And so we are very committed to using an intersectional lens to approach our work both internally within the Jewish community and as how we look at what is our responsibility as Jews. How must we show up in the broader world? What are the justice fights on which we must take a stand? We feel that we bring a particular perspective to those struggles, to those fights, to those movements as Jews, as LGBTQ people. Some of us are people of color, some of us grew up poor, some of us are people with disabilities. So people who experience both historically have experienced and continue to experience marginalization on a number of fronts. And so we bring that perspective and bring just a real clarity that we can only all move forward if we stand together.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Solorio, you're in a little bit of a different position, right? You represent the government of Mexico, and you're part of a consular network throughout the United States that ADL has been so grateful to partner with. Tell us what that means to you, that partnership, and how you see your role here in advocacy.
Thank you so much, Shira. And as I said, it's a privilege to be with you, Jerica, Edith, and Sonal. As we are aware, advocacy has many forms. And as you mentioned, I represent a government, and I have to advocate for the Mexican people here in the United States, as the same that the other representations do all over the world. But this representation is particularly significant because we have the largest Mexican population in abroad, not just in the United States. We have almost 5 million people, Mexican-born and Mexican descent. And most of them are vulnerable and are defenseless. So through education, we try to send the message that they are human beings, that they have rights, also obligations. But we are very lucky that as a government, as an authority, we can collaborate with other organizations, non-governmental organizations, as ADL, that since 2017, we started with workshops to sensitize the people that were, providing services, because we provide citizen services, humanitarian services. And so ADL was very helpful, and that led to the sign of an MOU. So the 50 consulates across the United States are embracing these workshops, and we're learning how to provide assistance and protect our people in a better position. So we're lucky that as a government, we have the NGOs by our side. Thank you.
Thanks. And so now, the Asian American Foundation is probably the newest, the youngest organization, but I'm sure advocacy is a key part of your work. If you can tell us about that.
Shira, thank you. And again, I'm just going to quickly echo what everybody else has said. It's such an honor and a privilege to be with this amazing group of women, actually talking about partnerships and advocacy. And really, I think the Asian American Foundation was founded last year because of all the anti-Asian hate, during the pandemic. And it's 23 million Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders in the United States. We were created in order to serve the community, but also serve the community in creation of belonging and prosperity, free from discrimination, slander, and violence. And what that means is advocating for our communities. So making sure when we see violence, when we hear about incidences of hate, that we stand up and we can speak, but also being able to do that for other communities when we see the same, because hate is hate. It doesn't matter which nationality, which color, which group, LGBTQ, Black, Latino, Latinx, it does not matter. Hate is hate. So making sure that we can stand up for that, but also to do it together, because it's not my hate versus your hate, but it is hate. And to make sure that we can do that. I'm grateful for ADL's partnership. Your CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, also serves on my board. And in fact, TAF was created because Jonathan went to the Asian American community and said, we're seeing all of this hate. Are you all going to do something about it? And truly have appreciated the willingness to come and talk together about it. But have, in my previous jobs, I've worked with the National Urban League, and I really appreciate the fact that we're going to have to do this together, because if we want to address hate and eradicate hate, it's going to take partnership, and it's going to take advocacy together as well as individually.
Great. Thank you so much. So I know a lot of people just think advocacy is good, getting on a bus and going to Washington or going to your state capitol and talking to policymakers. And that's a really important part of it. That's part of my job at ADL, is to encourage people to do that. And it's a passion of mine to make sure people know that they have a voice to use with policymakers. But I wanted to talk also about the other kinds of advocacy. And Adit, I know you've talked a little bit about internal advocacy, that's internal facing in a community, and I was hoping you could share some of those thoughts with us.
Sure. And I thank you for the question. And I do think that this kind of advocacy, is a piece of the work, even of the more kind of traditional lobbying organizations as well, because in order to garner support, for any effort, it starts in one-on-one conversations, and it starts in community institutions, and it starts with garnering support, for deciding to move forward. For us, what it looks like is being in conversation with Jewish community leaders, whether in educational institutions, in advocacy institutions, and social service organizations, and having conversations around what do you think it feels like to be an LGBTQ person walking into your building, or walking into your Zoom room, or opening your organization's website? Do people feel seen? Do people feel like this is an organization that knows that they exist? Do people feel like this is an organization that is speaking to their experience? And I think we can. I see some of the nods of the other panelists here. And I think we can apply these questions really to any group that is not a dominant group in society. What does it take to feel seen? What does it take to feel understood? To know that that a community, that a institution, that a government, that a society, will continue to have a place for you, no matter who you are. Will continue to employ you. Will continue to love you, as a member of the community. These are all critical questions that people, are asking, that people wrestle with when they consider engaging with different communities, engaging with different institutions, and we believe that institutions need to do the hard work. In realms of policy, in realms of program, in realms of leadership, who's represented, who's not represented, and then the most challenging realm, which is the realm of organizational culture, communal culture, because it's that it's those ineffable shifts in just how someone feels when they step into a space that are both the most critical and the most hard to achieve.
Yeah, and so I feel like that means that even for the person who maybe doesn't want to get political lobbying, or doesn't feel comfortable talking about legislative policy, there is an important role and responsibility for them in advocacy within their own organization, within their own community, and that there's a way to empower everybody to be part of that team. Jerica, do you want to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with the Urban League, both internal and external advocacy?
Absolutely. And when we're talking about internal advocacy, it's critically important. When we look at the National Urban League, we have 91 affiliates across the country. Some of those affiliates represent urban, suburban, and rural areas. So I think it's critically important that we have internal conversations about some of the challenges that are happening on the ground, that we share information, that we learn from each other, that we find commonality and really the ability to kind of galvanize together collectively to support each other in various endeavors. And I think we all can attest to the fact that where there is strength in numbers, there is power. And so that's what we do internally. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about advocacy from an external lens. As a former journalist, we talk about policy, we talked about activating communities. But one other critical piece of advocacy, I think, really has to do with public education and truth telling. So many of our communities have experienced a lot over the past years, and I mean, just over generations and decades. There are lessons to be learned in all of that. And I think sometimes the greatest way to really move people and to spur them to action, to pursue some of these policies or legislative reforms that are very much needed, is by storytelling, right? Public education is storytelling, being able to connect with each other on a really human level. We know that these different challenges that we have experienced also come with a load of experience that we can share and really collaborate together with each other. And I think, we're in a really special moment where coalition building is happening, and it's happening around the storytelling and talking about the experiences of each of our groups. And it really gives us the opportunity to kind of coalesce and really attack so many of the issues that are plaguing our communities, whether it's dealing with hate, inequity, lack of resources, or just being seen and being heard. I think there's a lot that can be done with both internal and external communication, and advocacy. But it really all starts with the ability to connect with one another and really tell the stories and the experiences of what's happening on the ground.
Ambassador, will you talk about what it's like being representing a very specific group of people in this country and trying to activate them and trying to make sure they feel safe, knowing what their rights are, knowing that they have rights here, when sometimes maybe some of the institutions don't make them feel so welcome or safe, and what it's like kind of taking action from that place of identity?
Yes, you have to take into consideration that we have to navigate the legal system here, and it's a different legal system from the one in Mexico. So to begin, we have to empower people through education, not just about their rights, but also about their, the services and the help and the assistance that there is in this country, because we're not used to many of the tools and workshops that you have here. So people has to have this consciousness or awareness that they have the right for these services, even though they are undocumented. That's the big challenge, because you were talking about being seen, invisibility. We want them to be visible. We want them to feel that they are entitled to all these services and help. And I'm just going to be very brief. I'm going to share an example with you. Here at the consulate, we provide documentation for more than 1,000 people every day. So there's a lot of people, but they can come, indigenous women belonging to the LGBTQ community, and they have, these intersectionalities that we have to deal with. And you were talking about internal advocacy. So, for example, I have to advocate for the LGBT community within my institution in order for them to empathize with these people and know how to address them, because we have to learn from each other and we have to respect each other.
So now, what about you? You've also said that people all of a sudden are paying attention. Now, anti-Asian hate is not new in this country, and from as long as people from Asian countries have come to this country, there has been discrimination and hate and violence. But in the last couple of years during COVID, we've seen it increase exponentially. We've seen a lot more people aware of it. What has that meant to be advocating from a place and for a community that may not be used to speaking out and seeking help from law enforcement?
Yeah, Shira, that's a great question. And thank you for that question. I would say, I think, and you're right, anti-Asian hate is not new. The Asian American community has been in the United States since the 1800s. And too often we just assume that it's a recent immigrant population, but Asian Americans have been here for a very long time. And so what I wanted to, just quickly talk about internal advocacy in three ways for us. One is we are also a very broad community. We're 40 different ethnicities, 20 different Pacific Islander communities. So making sure that we're in touch with all of our communities and making sure all of them are being represented and not just one group or another group. That internal advocacy is also reminding each of us internally that we are paying attention to all of our communities and recognizing it. For example, in COVID, the Pacific Islander and Hawaiian communities were very strongly affected, and making sure we're advocating for them and their needs and what is happening in Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities. So one is just our own internal pieces that we have to keep track of. The second is teaching our communities the models and modes of advocacy. So what do you do at city levels? Who do you talk to? How do you get there? Because too often what we do is we'll go talk within our community, but we don't actually go talk to the outside world. So we may have problems and we'll talk within our community, but we don't go to law enforcement, or we don't go to the city council, or we may not go to a mayor. So educating our communities about that is actually important. And then the third piece of this is educating the public about who the Asian American communities actually are and advocating for that, because we're not a monolith. We're 23 million people. There's no one Asian American community, and recognizing that there are these myths that you are the model minority, or there's no poverty in the Asian American community. In fact, the highest disparity of rich and poor is between the Asian American communities, of all the communities out there. So recognizing that these myths are things that we also have to break is also advocacy. Myths that we have to stop saying ourselves, but myths that we also need to educate the media, television, TV shows, making sure that those perpetuations aren't continued. So that we see as advocacy across the board. So internal, but also within our own communities as well as the outside.
Great. So I've been fortunate during my time at ADL. I've also served as regional director in Philadelphia and been able to work with many of you or your organizations or local affiliates. And I know that in those partnerships, we've found like-minded people. We've been able to find where the intersections of our missions are. But I'm wondering, and I'll start with you, Adit, what do you look for in a partner in your work? What is important to you? What makes a good partner, Takesha?
Some of the basics are, a person who will respond, a person who doesn't require a ton of chasing, and that is the culture of their organization, because none of us have the time for that. Because in our experience, responsiveness on the most minute level of emails, texts, and phone calls reflects a culture of responsiveness or lack thereof, on much more significant levels. So that's a very basic level. We look for partners who have a history of acting with integrity, which for us doesn't mean that they have always stood with us or have always been aligned with us on every issue, but it means that they have been driven by values and committed to their own integrity. We look for people who are willing to engage when we're not aligned. People who aren't going to walk away when there's friction or even when there's acute conflict, but who will have invested in relationships with one another so that there's caring and so that there's trust, and that will carry us through. Ideally, that will carry us through when we have those challenging political moments. And we stay committed to staying in conversation with each other. I think those are the key things we look for.
Now, Jerica, the ADL and National Urban League have partnered on lots of different things, whether it's legislation or education programs. And we, last year in Philadelphia, started a program around voting rights with our young leaders that you and I were both involved in. Like the ADL, with our regional structure, you said you have 91 affiliates. What's the best way to find those partners? Is it from the ground up? Is it from the top down? Can both work?
I think a little bit of both is critically important. The example that you gave, Shira, about our partnership in Philadelphia is a great one. First of all, it underscores the amazing work that was happening organically on the ground in Philadelphia, really around civic engagement and getting people to be educated about our voting process and really encouraging them to show up to the polls. And so you had two organizations that were able to connect around a shared common interest and investment in just a fair, equitable, and accessible process. And that organic relationship really blossomed. We saw several others happening in other parts of the country between our organizations. And what started as one grew to five. And then as a result of that, grassroots connection and the positive, experiences and outcomes, that really helped inform our leadership for ADL and for NUL to get together and say, wow, look at how great this was, how we were able to work together around this one particular issue in several communities. And it blossomed into a national partnership where we are engaging our young people and really activating them on a whole host of issues. We started with talking about voting, but we're now connecting folks across the country, and they're having substantive engagement around battling hate crimes and extremism. And so I really think it's a bottom up and a top down approach. I think for something to have longevity, you have to have buy-in from a national organization's leadership, but you have to have really strong, organic and meaningful relationships that are happening on the ground. That's what sustains the work.
Ambassador, can you talk about how it's kind of a similar question? You also have offices, the consulate has offices throughout the country, and I know you partner with different regional offices on programming. How do you find partners in the community to work with who will stand with your community, who you can stand with when they need support as well?
Yes, to answer this question, I would like to follow up on what Sonal said. She mentioned about the differences that Asian and Asian Americans, and that differences, we have them as well. We are not a monolithic population. So when I started working here in Los Angeles, you can say, well, this is from Mexico City, or was a Mexican that was born here from parents from Michoacan. And then you have to start building these bridges. And first you have to find the will to build the bridges and then to cross the bridges. So we started with conversations about our common history, and that might be not very comfortable for someone, because some will deny their Spaniard ancestors, or some of them will deny their indigenous ancestors. So you have to have the will to come together and to accept each other. So these conversations have been very helpful, even among Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and then with Anglos and other people from other nationalities.
Great. And so now, what happens when there's something you've been partnering with somebody, and then all of a sudden there's something you can't partner on, that you don't share the same agenda, or you're not prioritizing the same way? How do you move in and out of partnerships? What's like the secret to success to maintaining those partnerships, but not all the time?
Yeah, and sure, I think I'm going to build on sort of what Jerica and the ambassador talked about. I think one is just building trust, right? Whether it's top down, bottom up, making sure we have trust amongst partnerships, and that trust means honesty also. It's not just a papered over trust of, oh, we'll do it when it's convenient, but when there are tough times, we also have to be willing to have that trust to have some of those tough conversations. So when we think about partnerships, we're thinking about who do we partner with? How do we build those partnerships? How do we build a trust to know that we'll be there when something happens to other communities, as others will be for us, but to be able to have the tough conversations that we may be in slightly different places, right? So I'll give you an example from my own community. The Asian American community is diverse, not only from religion, but also diverse from ethnicity, diverse from political views, and we have to be inclusive of all of that. But there may be times when we have to be cautious about what we say, given where our community might be and who and how we're representing them. So I think it's important that we are able to have honest conversations, but I think it's important that we build that trust with all of our partners, so when we have those conversations, we can talk about it and say, listen, we're facing this problem. Are you facing the same thing? And can we have those conversations? So I have found where we've had really great partnerships is when we've built a trust, but also an honesty with that.
And Adit, I thought it was very interesting that you said that you're not always just partnering with organizations who have always been there for the LGBTQ community, that you're, I guess, willing to accept an evolution or a growth. And if you could talk about that a little bit, and if that's sometimes painful for members, or is it more we're welcoming where we are now? Oh, I can't hear you.
It's only been almost 2 years of doing panels by Zoom, but I still forget to unmute. So I said it's a great question, and one that is has been very current for us, since our earliest days. We have always, on the one hand, been clear that we are committed to meeting people where they are, wherever they are, and then sometimes lovingly, sometimes a bit more forcefully, always pushing people to go beyond where they think is possible. And one of, I just actually celebrated my 20th year anniversary at Keshet, and one of the most important things that I've learned over the last 20 years is that when you invite people to be their best selves, or even just their better selves, more often than not, they will rise to take you up on that invitation. And so, the numerous instances in which I have seen that happen, in which I have seen people who were opponents become proponents, people who were people who stood against us become allies, they give me a lot of hope at those junctures, which can be really painful, which can be moments when you just want to walk away. I also wanted to refer back to something that the ambassador said when you referred to, what on the one hand is very obvious, that the Mexican and Mexican American communities are not monolithic communities, and in fact none of our communities are monoliths, and so often people relate to the LGBTQ community, the Black community, the Asian American community, et cetera, as monolithic, when in fact we all have all of one another identity groups within our communities and within our organizations. And that's precisely why we work together and need to really emphasize the need to work together as much as possible.
So I had a great question from the audience that I want to pose to everybody. I guess I'll start with the ambassador. How should we advocate for the specific needs of particular communities without competing? They put that in quotations, but competing for attention, support, and funds with other identity-based organizations that are also fighting hate. How can we, I guess, if I'm going to use a little bit of Bible, how can we be for ourselves and for others and not feel that tension? So I'll start with you, Ambassador.
Yes, well, I love examples. And during the pandemic, we provide citizen services and assist and protect our people mainly. We're not supposed to give humanitarian aid or health services, but we did. And we transform ourselves in a hospital. We have a COVID-19 center, and we have a vaccine center, and we provided all these services to the whole Angelino community, not just the Mexican community. And it was wonderful to see how when we stand up and say, well, this is not just for Mexicans, we're here because we're human beings and we need each other now. And all the other consulates, the rest of the consulates from other countries, they joined. And we were able to provide all these wonderful, wonderful assistance and help to the people in need. So I think that if you have the resources, because I always say we're like a jet, we were in a boat, and some have these cruises, big boats, and some others have nothing. But if we put this to the service of the others, that will multiply. That's very important.
Jerica?
Multiply.
Yeah, well, I think one of the, let's just say this. All of the communities represented on this call are very resilient communities, and we have all had different experiences. Sometimes those experiences are similar, sometimes they're different. But I think what helps us all grow and advance is recognizing that we also have a responsibility to not just think specifically about our community, and recognize that all these challenges that one might be experiencing also has similar impacts on others. And I think it's critically important that we really move with the spirit of not only allyship, but move as accomplices. The COVID-19 pandemic, as the ambassador pointed out, impacted so many communities, so many marginalized communities. And if every community just focused on serving their constituents instead of kind of galvanizing together and really pushing for more resources for the whole, then I don't think we would be in the place that we are in right now. I mean, there is still much that needs to be done, but I think the advances we've made, the healing that's happened in our communities, and the awakening that's happened is because we moved together, honored the challenges that each community was having, but recognized that we all need a shared commitment to advancing opportunity for each other. I mean, there is a responsibility that we do need to take care of our communities, but we need to stand up for other communities as well. And we are all going to be stronger because of it.
Hadid? Oh, Sonal. Sorry, Hadid. Oh, she gave me the high sign.
Can I just add to Jerica's great point? I think just another example of this is when the Civil Rights Bill passed, it's when a lot of Asian Americans also benefited from having family migration happen. It was a large part of the Civil Rights Bill passing that gave what had not been given to Asian Americans, which is the ability for families to migrate. That is what the Civil Rights Bill did. So it required working together to get the civil rights legislation in order for all of us to benefit together. And so it's going to be that somebody might be in the lead, but when we all work together, we also get benefits, and that sometimes we don't talk about all of those benefits. And Shira, ADL's been doing this for a long time. So for example, when Tree of Life happened, when we all come together and address that and talk about it, the next time the Indianapolis shooting happens or Oak Creek happens for the Sikh communities, we know that this is going to come to other faith communities, or South Carolina. We know this is coming to other faith communities, and this is we have to work together. But it's important that we recognize we have also benefited when somebody else has succeeded. It's not just somebody else has succeeded at our expense. It's that we have benefited. And the Civil Rights Bill for the Asian American community was actually a super important bill for us.
And, Rabbi Meyer, who is a rabbi at one of the congregations at Tree of Life, was on a panel yesterday and said that exact thing, that this was an attack on not just one synagogue or just the Jewish community, but on Pittsburgh. And he talked about how Pittsburgh came together. I happened to have been in Pittsburgh that week working for another organization and really did feel embraced by the community at large, especially by the Black community that I was working with, the preachers and imams who came together to make people feel safe. And I think you're right that we see that often in times of tragedy, and we have to remember that times of success are also shared success. And Adit, I did not mean to cut you off from that.
No worries, there are a lot of us. Yeah, I'll just add to everyone else's comments, which absolutely resonate for me, that I think it's also really important as leaders to fight the scarcity mentality that is everywhere in our society, and to remember when people get into feeling like organizations or communities are competing with each other for resources, how much wealth there is in this country. How much wealth there is in philanthropy, how much wealth there is in government. I'm not talking about globally, but I'm talking about within this country. And I am a big believer in nonprofits sharing funding resources, sharing contacts, being generous with works and contacts, because in my experience, it's very rare for someone to decide, I'm going to stop funding this organization because I discovered this new one. They generally decide, I'm going to fund this new one as well. And so, where there are resources for one, there tend to be resources for many.
That's terrific. I mean, I hope that's true, and I think that's a good reminder for funders out there listening, to that we can do more. Our money can go farther. How do you motivate people? And I'll start with you, Jerica. How do you motivate your members to embrace your agenda, take the steps that you need, so it's not just Mark Morial, the CEO, making the case for whether you're advocating? I know you've been doing a lot for voting rights. I know you've been doing a lot, at least in my city, about eviction protection during COVID. How do you get your membership fired up and ready to go out there and do the work that needs to be done?
Well, I think part of it is that any issue that we would be kind of working to motivate folks around or get them fired up around really starts with issues that resonate with the overall collective. It's not just kind of sitting on high and giving a mandate to all of our membership and all of our volunteers. Part of my job and the role of my team is really to talk intimately with folks about what their challenges are, what's working well, and really getting a very clear picture of what's important to them, what they value, what their needs are. So then when we're talking about one particular issue, whether it be voting rights or, police accountability, it's because we've heard directly from them. And so it's not disconnected. It literally lives in the fabric of the organization already. And when you really start conversations with asking folks what they need, how can I help, and then moving from there, you start with the buy-in. And so, if anything, when we're talking about issues like voting rights, I mean, we have just really had an outpouring of support and engagement from all of our members and volunteers across the country. Why? Because we really listen to them, but then we also break it down for them and really be able to connect the dots. So if you're in Minneapolis and you've experienced really the fallout from George Floyd, we connect voting rights to police accountability and reform, right? Recognizing that we explain to everyone that voting is the foundation of our democracy. It's something that everyone should have free and fair access to. So whether we're talking about Texas, where they're also not only dealing with challenges at the ballot box because of race, but they're dealing with challenges because of the disabled community, which is intersectional, which represents so many of our communities, really connecting the dots to make sure that folks understand how all of these issues really connect together, I think is a huge motivating factor. But starting with talking to them first and understanding their needs and getting their buy-in. And I think that's how you move a group, and how you collectively are able to coalesce around any particular issue.
And Ambassador, and also Sonal, you both represent communities that historically have, while they've been the victims of bias and hate incidents and crimes, have been sometimes afraid to report, have felt mistrustful of authorities that could be of help, for legitimately distrustful. How have you worked to increase that and make people realize that speaking up is advocacy for themselves, for the community, and made them feel safer? I know Sonal, Stop AAPI Hate has been issuing these adjusted reports every quarter, and they're doing a look back to the beginning of COVID. The numbers keep coming up. The trust is building. So I can start with you, and then maybe Ambassador, you can fill in as well, because I know it's a similar problem that you've been dealing with for longer.
So Shira, that's a great point, and I think that it's important, for at least for us. It's our communities have not necessarily engaged with law enforcement on a regular basis, and similar to, I think, the what Ambassador may talk about with the Mexican community, the public charge rule didn't help. That if you get services, will I get maybe it's not just for those that are undocumented, but will I get my citizenship? Will I get these questions are real, and the information that's being said in public sometimes isn't being clarified. It's important for us to do that, but also building that trust. So we've opened up 3 centers in 3 cities, in Oakland, in Chicago, and in New York City, partnering with local organizations to really start building trust with local government and our communities. So the local government is coming to hear from the community, not just come tell the community what they want to, but hear what the communities are facing. And I think that's important. The second part is language access. A lot of our communities don't speak English. So when information is given out in English and not in local languages, people don't know how to translate that information, what that means, and that fear stops you from reporting because you're not really sure the next question or how to answer that question. And many of these questions on hate are very legalized questions, and there needs to be some way to be able to address that. And then finally, I think it's important that other community members come and help the communities themselves. So it's not just upon the victim, but how does the community support when something happens? And that's why these localized centers have been created. But we know that in order to do that and to build that trust with local government, it's going to take the work, and we see it as upon ourselves as the foundation to be able to bring the city, state, local government, county governments together to meet with the community to have a dialogue.
Ambassador?
Yeah, we are very lucky to have 50 consulates across the United States. So it's like mini embassies. And then we have this opportunity to build up with the local authorities, with the local organizations. And this is very, very important work. And I think that the most important thing that we do is lead by example. Regarding, leadership, is that we are coherent, is we do what we say, and that people, as you were saying before, trust us, because it's very difficult to be an authority and have the the trust of the people right away. They trust better an NGO or someone else or the compadre, but not the authority. So maybe they come here reluctant to come. But what I do is that my team and we lead by example. So the way we address someone, the way we treat someone else, the way we respect the other, the way we respect the country that is hosting us is also important, because we want to lift up my community. We want to become go from victims to protagonists. That's the change of mentality that we have to have.
Adit, somebody wanted to dig a little deeper on something you said, so hopefully you can help us out. They said, how do you invite people to be their best selves and to turn former opponents or neutral parties into proponents and allies? What does that work look like?
Well, that's a month-long conversation for me to answer fully, but I would say, I'll tell a story. So There is a Jewish day school that reached out to us because there was a fifth grader who came out as transgender and wanted people to start using he, him pronouns for him. And there were a lot of parents who, in the community, it's a pretty traditional community, who weren't comfortable with that and felt like the kids were too young to talk about these issues. And the head of school who reached out to us was kind of siding with the parents. And that obviously was not going to be our position, that the school shouldn't support this child. Our position was the school should support this child and use this as an opportunity to address issues of gender diversity and difference more broadly in the school community. So the way I invited this head of school to be their best self or their better self, as I didn't use that language with them, but internally, was I told them stories of other trans kids, of trans adults I know, and we were talking before about how do you motivate people to feel inspired about an issue. For me, it's about transforming the issue so that it's humanized from an abstract issue into people's lives. So people in that community were getting stuck on these ideas of what it means to be trans and the trans experience and what that could possibly mean for their children and for the community. But they weren't thinking about how this kid felt. They weren't thinking about the experiences and the perspectives of trans kids and trans people of all ages around the country. They weren't thinking about this is a recent experience. They weren't thinking about what it could feel like for that child, to be listening to the evening news and watch someone their age address the Arkansas state legislature and say, if you pass this law prohibiting gender affirming healthcare for trans kids, kids will die. And then watching that law get passed. So it was that kind of real intense focus on kind of, what this experience is like for this human being who is in your community, that I'm glad to say it doesn't happen every time, but in the case of this head of school, made them recognize that, if it was a value for their school community, for the school to be a place where all kids could feel a sense of safety and belonging, they were responsible to this child too.
That's great. Thank you. And that harkens back to what Jerica said early on about the powers of storytelling and education and narrative in the work that we do. So as we're getting towards the end, I want to give you each kind of a couple minutes to either share a success story, share where you think, the evolution of partnerships should go, whether words of advice or lessons for the audience about partnership and advocacy. So we each have just under 2 minutes, just like we did with the opening. And I'll start with you, Ambassador.
Okay. Well, I just want to send the message that now that, the audience is listening to us, and I can see Jerica, Edith, Sonal, and you, Shira, amazing women, success women that are doing so much for our communities. Just remember that we were kids once, and we were teenagers once, and we had to fight a lot of battles, and we're still fighting a lot of battles. So I would like to encourage them to believe in themselves and fight for what you believe in. I think that's the most important thing, and have the generosity to share and support other people.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Jerica.
Well, again, I just want to say thank you for this conversation. I think if I were to lift up a success story, it would be to be us and all of the many people that really came together in 2020, which was probably one of the most challenging years in a long time, not for just the United States, but for the world. And I think it's a reminder of how much we can accomplish when we see each other, when we listen to each other, and when we stand up for each other. In many respects, for me, I really see this movement that is happening across the globe and the interconnectedness that we see, the coalitions that we see forming as indicative of a modern civil rights movement. We saw all of the gains that so many of us benefited from during that movement, and the access and the opportunities that came from that. And so, I would just encourage everyone that's tuning in to remember that each of us are our brother or our sisters or the next human being's keeper, and that we are walking in a success story right now. And if we continue to move with that spirit and the mindset of how important it is to advocate for one another and support one another, that we can accomplish so much more.
Adit?
I love what you just shared, Jerica, and you too, Ambassador. To add an additional component, I would say to everyone listening to hold on to the power of the story. Hold on to the power of your story, of knowing where you come from, being clear about why it is that you care about whatever it is that you care about. Knowing your story will make you a more powerful advocate for yourself, for others, for whatever you choose to advocate for. So important to be clear about your why. And then knowing your story will enable you to be seen by others and enable you to see others. And it's that seeing, it's that understanding of where you come from, of where you're going, of why that is, of what are the factors that have led to you being where you are, that have stood in your way, that have propelled you forward, that have lifted you up. That will enable you, to act with clarity about your own foundation and be able to see that in others and be able to stand together with others in the most powerful way.
Thank you. And Sonal?
Shira, first I want to just say it's awesome to be on a panel with all women who have given such incredible advice, comments. Like, seriously, I wish I had this when I was young. I want to say the biggest thing here, and just to everybody, and I think as the ambassador said, to all the young people, it's going to be hard, but know that we see you and know that we're here to defend and to be there to help you. Keep pushing the agenda. It's hard. It's hard to be the person that is pushing the agenda, but keep pushing the agenda. And know that we're here. For those of us that are my age, let's give room and grace to all the young people that we were them at one point, and we were the ones fighting, that they also need a place to fight, and give them the room to make the mistakes or to do it right. I mean, they might actually have better ideas and probably do, but give them the grace to do it, because it's hard. And I think they're fighting for the right reasons. Their hearts are in the right place, and it's up to us to also not just help them, but to get out of the way sometimes. And it's important that we do that. And as Edith said, keep doing. You're in it. We see you all the time. Please find yourself in everything that you do, because we're here for you. We're not gonna run away. We're not gonna go away. But I think I would say for all of us that, at least for my age group, which is the 50s, it's for us to actually give room and grace to a generation that is thinking differently and frankly pushing things that sometimes we didn't get done in our own time.
Well, thank you. I can't stop smiling. This was terrific. It is not a mistake that there are amazing women on this panel. I will confess, send the picture of this panel to many of my mentors and women friends and say, did you notice anything about this panel? But I want to thank you all for your time and for your partnership. I look forward to continuing to work with you all. To our audience, before you go, please click on the full agenda button at the top of the page to see the full slate of panels. You can add your voice to the conversation on social media. Tell us why you're fighting anti-Semitism and hate using the hashtag #NeverIsNow. And please join us for our next panel, Confronting Anti-Semitism on Campus, a how-to guide that's sponsored by Hillel at 4:30, and tonight our closing program at 7:30. Thank you so much.